Welcome everyone to today's RD2RD Live Show. My name is Megan Boitano, and today I have Heather Caplan with me. She, fellow dietitian, podcaster, and the founder of Weight Inclusive Nutrition and Dietetics, known as WIND. And we're talking about the topic of weight inclusive nutrition, and really from a standpoint of how do you apply it in practice, as well as really diving into what it is and what it isn't. I feel like this I really wanted to talk about this topic with Heather because one, I love her podcast, and I like how, she really talks about topics in a way that's really approachable, understandable, and really a thought leader and passionate about this topic. So I thought, who better to bring on and really introduce us to this topic. So, Heather, thank you for being here. And why don't you, for those of you who are listening in, just kind of as a, housekeeping, we are both dealing with background noise today. So I have construction going on right in the wall next to me. So lots of giant pounding, and Heather is in kind of a co-working space today. So we hope that the noise doesn't cause any issues with the quality of you hearing us. If it does, drop something in comments. We'll do what we can, but just so you know, that is something we have going on today.
Yep. Sorry in advance.
Sorry in advance. That is life. So Heather, why don't you go ahead, talk a little bit about your career journey, and I always love to learn how you kind of ended up where you are, becoming passionate. You have a lot of different things that you're interested in, so you can talk about those and also about WIND.
Sure. So I'll give some of the highlights and the lowlights, but keep this relatively brief so we can dive into everything else today. But I did start in community nutrition. So I was a WIC nutritionist for my first job here in the DC area. And then I worked in corporate wellness for almost 5 years. And in both of those jobs, I was expected to be very weight centric. That's like part of the model. There was a lot of focus on weight, a lot of focus on weight loss, a lot of health screenings, talk about BMI, talk about cholesterol and triglycerides and all the other things that we think about when we think about health. And so within those job environments, I would say I was a little bit resistant, but I didn't really have any language for that or any reason that I could pinpoint why I felt like I didn't really align with a lot of the things that we were doing. And it's so normal that I just didn't really question it for a long time. But it did kind of cause me to start to feel a little disassociated from dietetics in general, especially at the end of my corporate wellness career. I really felt like this just isn't what I want to do. I don't want to always talk to people about weight loss. It doesn't feel right to me. And it feels a little bit harmful. Like I feel like I'm always encouraging behaviors that to me are a little bit disordered and feel a little bit extreme. So I didn't really have a language for that, but I did feel like it was kind of just not in line with the way that I wanted to practice as a dietitian. So then, kind of out of left field, I was recruited for a startup. And this was in San Francisco. We were living in California at the time. So this was in San Francisco, and I was the only dietitian on the team. And what we were focused on was building group nutrition programs online. So basically like courses before we really had courses. Now they're ubiquitous.
Before it was cool and everybody had
it. Yeah, exactly. So we were kind of trying to figure out what that looked like. That was a big part of my job. And then we also were a content site. So we had blog posts and articles about fitness and nutrition and health and just kind of general like pop culture topics. And it was all from what really was a weight neutral, weight inclusive, non-diet lens, but none of us had that language. Again, like didn't know what intuitive eating was, didn't know what health at every size was. But the team of people who started this company were really interested in having that content available to more people and not focusing on a certain body type or a certain number of calories or a certain health ideal. So we were ahead of our time, like no question.
Very much so.
Yeah, and it was actually through that job I got to work with a lot of other dietitians. So because we were building these group nutrition programs, I got to contract with and hire dietitians, and I ended up trying to find people that I didn't feel like were very diet focused. And that's actually how I was introduced to intuitive eating through some of the RDs that we got to work with there. And then eventually was led to Health at Every Size. I think I first heard about that through Christy Harrison's podcast, but I don't really remember exactly. And then, spoiler, that company folded, as startups tend to do. And it just really felt like the right time for me to kind of venture out and do my own thing, which is something I had been thinking about for a while. So I took a lot of what I learned in that environment, including like the intuitive eating and health at every size language, and I felt ready to kind of build my own business. So I've been working for myself for almost, exactly like 3 years now.
Oh, congrats.
Yeah. I do want to include, just before we dive into everything else today, I want to include a quick note on the language that I'll use. So
yes.
As I was thinking through my answers for different questions, I just wanted to make sure that I called this out right away, which is that I will describe bodies as fat or thin. And the reason for that is I don't use the words overweight or obese because they're stigmatized and they imply a disease state. And I have used, but I'm trying not as often to use the words larger body or higher weight because that implies a comparison to a thin ideal. So I have used those words.
Really good point about language, about what is, if you're trying to use the right language, it can feel challenging especially as a dietitian who maybe isn't as well versed. So I think just starting to talk about the language is very helpful.
Yeah, and I want to say that if you're working with clients, I think it's really important to ask the client what they prefer. So sometimes they prefer fat, sometimes they prefer larger bodies, sometimes they prefer higher weight, sometimes they prefer that you don't describe their body at all, and that's also fine. That's totally possible. So I just wanted to kind of include that disclaimer that I will use fat as a very neutral word. It does in our culture have a lot of negative implications, but I will use it as a really neutral word so that the way I describe bodies doesn't feel like a comparison to someone else. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for providing that. So let's dive in. For those of you joining us, if you have specific questions as we go along, feel free to drop them in comments. I have those up. I'm perusing them as we go along. Otherwise, we've got a lot on deck to cover today.
Yeah.
So really kind of I think I want to really dive into what is weight inclusive and what really isn't. And I know it really feels, like I said, like a really basic question to say, what is weight inclusive care? And then we're going to start talking about what it isn't and comparing it to some of these other terms you started to use: health at every size, intuitive eating, food freedom, body, like there's all this lingo. When you, as an expert, right, founder of weight inclusive nutrition and dietetics, what does weight inclusive nutrition mean? What is that?
So the weight inclusive approach is sort of the opposite of what we think of as, what is described as a weight centric or weight normative approach. So even those words might sound really foreign to a dietitian. But the way to think about a weight centric or weight normative approach is basically our education and our healthcare system. So the weight inclusive approach, specifically to nutrition and dietetics, is one that doesn't focus on weight as a goal or an outcome or a valuable measure of someone's health. So it is one measurement that we have, but we don't have to put it on such a pedestal and say this is a huge indicator of whether someone is healthy or not. So the weight inclusive approach kind of puts all that stuff aside and focuses much more on behaviors, what's important to our clients or the communities that we're serving, what's accessible to the clients or the communities that we're serving, and also ways in which we can increase access to care. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later, I think. But basically the weight inclusive approach, again, is one that doesn't focus so heavily on weight, no pun intended, and that doesn't see weight as a outcome that we can predict or one that we can promise or even one that we need to be focusing on. And then it also provides us a way to give our clients non-stigmatizing care. So as I said earlier, when we use the terms overweight or we use the terms obesity, it often has an implication. It has an assumption based around that word that you don't take care of yourself, that you have gained weight because of XYZ behaviors. Like we make a lot of assumptions based on those words and those terms, and even obesity itself is considered a disease state and so within the medical and healthcare field. And so removing those words and removing weight as a measure of health allows us to provide non-stigmatizing care for our clients and to focus more on what they're concerned about, what their health goals are, and increasing that access to care. Right. I guess, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
So then like what it isn't.
Yeah.
So the opposite of weight inclusive care, as I said, is the weight centric model. And that's what most of us received our education in. I don't want to say all of us because I can't speak for every single dietitian in the world, but it's the healthcare norm, right? It's the way medical students are taught, it's the way nursing students are taught, dietitians are taught. We are taught to see weight as an indicator of health, and dietitians specifically are taught to coach people or counsel people on how to lose weight. And we see that as a tangible, predictable outcome instead of actually seeing it as a way that we're trying to manipulate a body that can't really be manipulated. We don't have any long-term evidence showing that weight loss is sustainable for anybody. So we'll talk about that later too, I'm sure, when we get into the evidence. But we basically, within that weight-centric or weight normative model, we assume that if weight goes up, health declines. And then if weight goes down, health improves. Like it tends to be as simple as that, even though I would argue that everyone listening knows it's more complicated than that. But that's kind of what the basis of our education is built on. So it's a really simplistic view that ignores a lot of other determinants of health. And it also, as I was saying earlier, with the weight inclusive care, we're trying to provide that non-stigmatizing care and that equal, respectful access to care. Within a weight-centric model, there are a lot of assumptions made about someone's body based on the way that it presents in the world, and we're just trying to dismantle the systems that have allowed that to happen.
Yeah, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about our own biases as practitioners and how do we start to recognize them. It's always hard to see something in yourself, so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that. But I hear a lot of other terms. For example, we hear non-diet, we hear anti-diet, we hear body positive, we hear food freedom, we hear intuitive eating, we hear health and everything. Is this all the same thing? Are we all just using the different, or these just synonyms?
Yeah. Well, I won't make a blanket statement and say they're all exactly the same things. I think that people interpret them differently and they use them differently. So they're popular hashtags. We'll say that.
Yeah.
I do think that kind of non-diet, intuitive eating, anti-diet, those are mostly the same things. I think there's a lot of misconceptions around probably all of those terms. And some dietitians choose not to use non-diet or anti-diet because it sounds a little bit negative. Like there's, I'm like standing against this, but that is mostly what we're doing. We're standing against a culture that prioritizes like dieting and weight loss and sees that as like the ultimate pinnacle of health. So in some ways, the negative connotation is like, yeah, we're trying to fight against this. We're trying to show people that they don't have to always have this negative association with their body and with food and with how they're eating. Mm-hmm. So food freedom is a principle of intuitive eating. Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of sometimes that's used as a more like widely understandable term, I guess. Like if you hear intuitive eating, you're like, what? But if you hear food freedom, you're like, well, that sounds nice.
Yeah. I want to be free.
Yeah.
And I think going back to your comment about, if we're looking at weight inclusive as, we'll talk a little bit more about the evidence, but if you're a dietitian, and right, we have people who are coming to us with a goal of weight loss. We get referrals from physicians or, other providers that are related to weight, that people come to us that they're really not in a position of wanting to accept their body. And I think I hear a lot in different groups that I'm in is helping our clients work, and I know that's kind of outside of the scope, but how do we, when we're trying to grow our business, right? We're trying to attract people, and people are like, well, I'm not in the business of, I don't want to go and see a dietitian to learn to accept myself as I am. Do you see what I'm not sure I'm using the right words, but it's challenging.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, marketing is a challenge for everyone who owns a business, no matter what your business is focused on. And I think that we have seen that diets sell and that weight loss sells, right? So, I mean, part of the issue with like getting this message out there is it's not really what people want to hear. And I have even heard, so I'm just going to call it out before we even get there, but I've heard that weight inclusive approaches and health at every size are not patient centered, because if the patient wants weight loss, we should give that to them. And I think that that's a really selective argument, because I don't think you would extend that same logic to, if a patient comes to me and wants to do this 21-day cleanse that Beyonce's talking about, I should help them do it. No, right? Like we are the knowledgeable expert and we are the credentialed healthcare provider who is meant to not do any harm. And so if we start looking at the research and we start kind of doing our own work around like how we think about dieting and health and weight, and we start to unlearn a lot of cultural and societal norms, then we're able to say, like, this is very much a patient-centered approach in that I'm providing them with information that they can then make an informed decision on. If that person still wants to choose to lose weight and they want to work with a weight loss provider, who am I to judge them or to say that's wrong? It's just not a good fit for my practice, and that's not what I'm going to help them do.
Got it.
If someone comes to me and they say, yeah, I'm really looking for a dietitian for weight loss, I'll explain my approach very gently. I mean, most people are not ready to hear this right away, right? So I have like my talking points that kind of like, we'll focus on health promoting behaviors, whatever that might mean for you and your health goals. And what I will say is that I can't promise a weight outcome, and I don't focus on weight loss. So if your weight goes down or it goes up or it stays the same, I remain very neutral about that, so long as we're focusing on the things that are important to your health and important to you. But if they really want someone who's going to guarantee weight loss, one, I think that's an empty promise, but we're taught to promise that, right? We're taught to provide that, and that we're taught that it's possible. And so I just will say, like, if that's still something you're really interested in, that's fine. We're just not a great fit. But yeah, I think you speak to a lot of the challenges that we face in this world, which is that people want quick fixes. They want diets. They want to change their body because they're taught that their body is wrong as it is. And that's really hard to work up against.
So if we talk about, we're going to kind of switch, if we start to talk about evidence and around the concept of kind of weight stigma, like how that versus outcomes data on health and weight. So I, would kind of see those two as two different things, right? If we look at, weight stigma and actual research on weight those are two different things. So let's first maybe talk about weight stigma and examples and kind of what's the research around being as a practitioner as well as in the way why is it important? What's out there that says it is?
Yeah, so first, just in case anyone is like, what do they mean when they say weight stigma? Stigma is a negative connotation surrounding something. So when we say weight stigma, what we really mean is weight-based discrimination. So people are experiencing discrimination or microaggressions against them because of their body, because of the way that their body presents, because of something they really have no control over. And so what we have seen in the research with weight stigma is that it is correlated with negative health outcomes. So I would be really interested in someone, and I don't want to be this person, but someone sitting down and looking at all the research we have that supports weight, that suggests that weight gain is related to negative health implications. And actually, let's remove weight as that sole focus here. And let's look at the behaviors, and let's look at the lived experiences, and let's look at the social determinants of health. And I'm sure there has been a lot of research where like they say that they're controlling for these things, but we can't measure weight stigma. We can't measure shame and things that have happened to people in their lived experiences. So what we do see in the research around weight stigma, most of it has been looking at healthcare providers and how weight stigma manifests in a healthcare setting. And what we see is that nurses, physicians, dietitians, and other healthcare providers have all acknowledged that they do have weight stigma and that they do bring that into their practice. So these are surveys that have been done with these different healthcare providers. And what we see with physicians specifically is that as BMI increases, so we can talk about BMI not being a great measure of health, but regardless, in this instance, as BMI increased, they were less likely to spend time with the patient. They made assumptions about their behaviors and their lifestyle. They had less patience with their patient, like they acknowledged this. And they saw those patients like with a higher BMI as a waste of time. So how does that feel as the person in that doctor's office who is experiencing that stigma? An example that I can provide for my own client work is that I have a client who lives in a fat body and always has, like even as a child, and has been put on countless diets over and over. By the time that I met this person, they were in their early 30s and hadn't been to the doctor in 10 years. No physical, no annual checkup. Unless there was something really extreme going on, they avoided doctors completely. And that's part of how weight stigma manifests in healthcare. And what we see in the research is that there is an avoidance of care, which means that sometimes we have a delay in diagnoses, like cancer diagnosis, for example. They've looked at specifically women who avoid getting mammograms because they experience weight stigma in the doctor's office. So they avoid going for those routine checkups, and then their breast cancer is diagnosed much later in like the stage of the cancer, and therefore they have a lower likelihood of treating the cancer.
Right.
So then what we see in the research is higher weight is associated with more incidences of breast cancer. But if we could have screened earlier, or we could have like noticed some of the early signs, like, would that be true? I don't know. I can't say for sure. But what we
I
see
think that like manifests over into a dietitian. Like, you would be avoiding seeing us because perhaps we, of course, maybe have that signal, but have that focus on, weight, so that people don't want to engage in our services. That having this weight inclusive approach provides more access to care that is good, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just access to respectful care. So because we are trained in a weight-centric model, we have internalized fat phobia, we have internalized weight stigma, and we don't think to question a lot of those things until we do, right? Like, I question those things now, but for a long time, it was just like, that's what we were taught. It's what we hear over and over and over again. So why would I do anything different? And then from that client side, like, again, they're getting weight-based discrimination and microaggressions literally all day, like chairs that don't fit, bathrooms that are too small, like, I mean, you name any situation during your day and you've experienced it. But then to bring that into healthcare, like, that impacts the care that they have access to because they don't feel respected in that environment.
Right. And I really like that you gave some specific examples, in both from your client work, but also as a dietitian, and why, it matters, right? Because you talked about it being not patient-centered, but I also think you made that point about, knowing, doing no harm, doing what's best, and really putting the patient at the center. And I think being careful how we spin things. And I want to transition a little bit, but talking about this idea of, I feel that this is a very polarizing topic for registered dietitians. And I feel a lot of times that you have to pick a side. If you pick the wrong side, it's like this either jump on support or jump on gang up, and I think it's a very challenging thing for our profession. And how do we talk about this topic in a way that allows the word dialogue without just sharing of, I believe this and I believe that, and there really isn't any dialogue and learning. I think dialogue is just lacking in general in the world, but in our profession, I feel like this is an important topic. Weight is so much of what our profession gets put on us, and what does being a dietitian look like, and can we respect each other? So talk to me about this topic of how it's polarizing, and what should we be doing? What could we be doing differently?
Sure, of course. So, I mean, so many thoughts to share on that. But first, I will say, like, what both sides need to be better at.
Sides. I love how we just have to call it like a side.
I know. Well, okay. So for the sake of this discussion, I will say that, like, what we both, like, all of the worlds have to be more cognizant of is creating that space for dialogue and being curious and being open-minded. And I think there is a tendency from either approach to not do that. Like, we feel so strongly about what we're doing that it can be hard to remember. Like, it is important to invite curiosity, to think critically, to ask questions, and to have that space for dialogue. I think that based on the conversations I've had in the past couple of years, especially as we've gotten wind off the ground and we've had these events and we have discussions around this at these events, like, how can we do better? Like, we don't want to be the people that someone thinks is like policing their language or like telling them they're doing it wrong. We don't want that. And they don't want that from us, and we don't want it from them. Like, it goes in every direction, right? But I think that what we see when there's kind of the weight-centric model and the weight-inclusive model, the weight-centric model, again, it's what we've always known. It's what we were taught within. It's what the basis of healthcare stands on. And I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of resistance to changing that because it's what we've always done. And like, how many systems operate just because of what's always been done, right? And that's always frustrating, no matter what you're up against, like in a job, in an organization, on a board, like, oh, well, we can't do that. We tried it before, it didn't work. Well, like, could we try it again? Like, could we just give it another shot? Like, change, I think, is always really hard. And so I want to acknowledge that. I think there's always like the fear of the unknown. If you've never done it this other way, then like, where do you even start? we could talk about that. And then I think there's a little bit of shame, if I'm being honest. Like, I have had no issues calling myself out on things I did in my past dietitian life because I am so confident in this approach and it feels so much better to me. And I have no cognitive dissonance anymore, that I'm like, there's no question in my mind that I will always be a weight inclusive provider and I will always fight for weight inclusive care.
Is there
But
a place for weight-centric dietitians? So I'm just going to throw that. If you have, let's say, there are dietitians who've built a practice around helping people achieve weight loss, let's say, and their passion is that the reason that they really feel passionately about weight loss as something they bring to their clients. And do these two worlds exist, or is there just, is the vision that just doesn't happen? I guess.
No.
How do the two sides, like, is this two sides, like, we just have to become, what happens here?
I'll go ahead and take a stance,
okay,
as unpopular as it might be. But I will say that, first of all, to the dietitians listening or who identify as like, I've done weight loss, I've had it on my website, I've done it with clients, I still do it, I still offer it. To those dietitians, my guess is that a lot of this resonates with you and a lot of it makes sense to you. Of course, you don't want to do any harm. Of course, you want to provide respectful care. Like, a lot of these things resonate, but then there's that weight loss piece. Like, oh, what do I do about that?
Yeah.
My guess is that you are focused on behaviors, right? Yeah. Like, it is still a focus on behaviors, but then there is that outcome of weight. I don't think that the weight-centric model can exist in a world where we don't have weight stigma. So, like, those two things can't exist. We can't have a weight-centric model and have a weight stigma-free world. It's just not the case. You know, like, we can't have white supremacy and not have racism, right? Like, or we can't have them, like, they both exist because one exists because of the other. So I think that if we have a weight loss focused practice and we have a weight centric model, we are perpetuating weight stigma, whether we intend to or not. I do not mean to say that people who practice in a weight loss model are trying to do harm. I don't think that at all. Of course I don't. Like, we're all dietitians. We got into this because we want to help people. But if the focus is, yes, I can help you change your body and manipulate your body to fit this thin ideal in this world that we live in, we're supporting the thin ideal. Again, I might work with someone on intuitive eating practices and food freedom and breaking away from the idea that weight is related to health, and their weight might go down, it might go up, it might stay the same. I have no idea of saying, like, or predicting that. So I just stay neutral about it.
I actually think you made a really good point. So the first thing you're saying is that behaviors, that all of us, no matter, you know, if what are we using as an outcome measure, and that is the focus, right? A lot of us are focused on the behaviors because ultimately we know, like, we can't, like you were saying, weight loss happens or it doesn't.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it's really focused on the sustainable behaviors that our clients are engaging in and how does that feel right for them.
Right.
I think this is important to talk about, especially your perspective as far as what are we really telling ourselves and what are we necessarily believing, and what belief system do we subscribe to, and how does that feel on the inside? And I don't necessarily think that. So what do we, when we're talking about, like, the research world, I think there's this difficulty of kind of qualitative and quantitative, and we're constantly butting up against, you know, published research where, you know, we're always going to be saying, so what's the evidence? So if we want to say, well, I don't want to harm, that someone might argue that, you know, an increasing BMI, that having diseases associated with a higher BMI is exceptionally harmful, right? Or they might say, so, you know, how do we, if, you know, you're going to say, how do you, as a weight inclusive practitioner, respond to that, and what needs to be done to have better, you know, data, I guess?
Yeah. So, I mean, those are all really thoughtful questions. I think that what I have learned from PhDs and professors and people who are in the research world is that it is really difficult, at least in this current climate, to get funding for a weight inclusive, non-diet focused study. So, like, that is a challenge we're up against. Obesity has a lot of money, like, full stop. So they're funding the research. You know, we always say, like, look at who's funding the research. Like, if it's an article about sugar not being toxic, which I don't think sugar is toxic, just as an example, like, is the sugar industry, like, funding the research, right? Like, there's always, we have to look at that. And so, one, I think there's just a lot of challenge in getting research through that challenges the weight-centric norm, because that doesn't serve the diet industry and it doesn't serve the obesity world that has millions, if not billions of dollars. So that's a challenge. When we look at the data that does exist, there is so much weight bias in data. And we're all going to bring our own personal bias to the way that we read and interpret research. Like, I acknowledge that.
Or the studies that we even look at. The searches we put in on PubMed. We're only searching for the topics we want to, confirmation bias. I want to know that what I believe is true. Right. Okay,
is true. Sure. Yeah. So then again, as I think I kind of alluded to this earlier, but when we do look at a lot of those studies, like, first of all, you're going to see that almost no matter what nutrition or health study you look at, whether weight was like part of the hypothesis or the thing that they were testing or not, it's mentioned somewhere. Like, it just has to be mentioned for some reason. So we just see that so pervasively. We see the evidence of the impact on weight stigma in healthcare. There is evidence that correlates weight cycling, or weight going up and down, which is almost a guarantee for anyone who's ever been on a weight loss diet. There is evidence correlating weight cycling to negative health outcomes. So that's harmful. And there is almost no evidence that shows us that weight loss is sustainable long-term, especially in the absence of disordered behaviors, right? So when we look at people who have sustained weight loss long-term and they've managed to keep their body at a lower weight than what it was before, a lot of things could be happening. One, that could be that they came back down to their set point after different behaviors and mental health issues were addressed, and like, that was important to them. And maybe they're just back at their set point and that's how they're going to maintain it. But for many people who have lost weight and maintained it, when we take it and look at it with a critical eye, we see a lot of disordered behaviors and we see a lot of mental harm that was done by them believing that if I ever go back to this old weight, or I change my behaviors and I allow myself more food freedom or a healthier relationship with food in my body will probably change, and therefore I will once again experience consistent stigma and discrimination. Who wouldn't want to avoid that, right? So I guess more to your question, when we see the correlation of higher weight, negative health implications, I really just encourage dietitians to look at that evidence from a different perspective. What are the behaviors that we can look at? An example would be, I got in an argument with a PhD on Twitter, as will happen. And
that's what happens on Twitter.
It was an argument kind of based around when Kurbo came out, and which is the Weight Watchers app for kids. We don't have to go down that road if you don't want to, but he was saying that there's no evidence showing that dieting causes eating disorders. But what we see is significant evidence correlating dieting with eating disorders. And so I popped in and said, well, we also don't see evidence that weight causes negative health implications. Like, we don't see that. And this was a bad argument for me to get into for a number of reasons, but mostly that, like, I'm then kind of supporting his argument that there's a correlation, not a causation. So I shouldn't have done that. But He said, why would you say that? Like, basically trying to make me feel like an idiot, as some PhDs will do. And he said, there's a study where we show that if you overfeed people and they end up at a higher weight, they have negative health implications. I'm like, why doesn't the overfeeding stand out to you? Like, you overfed them. So why wouldn't we assume that, like, if someone's eating more than what they need consistently, especially in a lab setting where, like, it's probably calculated to overfeed them, like, why wouldn't that have some sort of implication on their health? I mean, who's to say, like, we could extrapolate that in a lot of different directions. But again, when we're looking at that correlation data, one, it's not causative. So I think that's really important. Two, look at, like, all the other things that are happening. Look at the social constructs, look at weight stigma, look at lived experiences, look at social determinants of health, look at genetics. Like, some people that have a fat body have always been in a fat body and they've always been healthy. And I think that then kind of, like, turns a lot of emphasis on to, like, well, everyone should be healthy and we should make everyone healthy. We should make them healthy to the extent that they want to be healthy and that's important to them, right? But we don't have to police it onto everybody. So yeah, I hope that answers.
I think you made a really good point about, as far as what is important to your client, like the life that they're living, the quality that they're experiencing, and I think for a lot of, myself included, I turned 40 this year, for all of you who are listening in, and there was a lot, that's a big time in your life of, what have I accomplished? What do I want to accomplish? What have I been subscribing to that hasn't really been filling me up? And I think it was really interesting. I reflected back like in my late 20s, right? I had this job where I was a manager and I was, I got to wear the heels and I had all the busy meetings and I was probably the most miserable I'd ever been. My employees would come up to me like, Megan, it's amazing. You just published a new paper and you're a mom and you're doing all of this. And I was holding it together like, yes, they're putting you up on this pedestal of look at all of what you've accomplished. But on the inside, like I hated everything about myself and who I was. And yet, like
Yeah,
talking about now, like, I do meditation every day and different things that on the inside, maybe someone would say you don't wear heels and sometimes you wear yoga pants, but what's going on the inside of my body, I would say has an effect on inflammation and how I feel and just the
right,
life that I'm living every day. And that matters. Like
right.
how you're living
Exactly.
every day matters. I really do believe
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Like if
No
I
matter
can
your
help,
body size, right? Your body
right.
size.
Right. Like if I can help someone not obsess over food 24 hours a day, not obsess over the way their body looks in the mirror 24 hours a day, not be worried about going to a doctor's office. I mean, I can't cure that stigmatization, but I can try to at least prevent it. And I can at
Mhm.
least provide an environment in which it is not supported. Right.
Right. And I think that's kind of, what we're talking about, this whole idea of dialogue and conversation, and this whole idea of finding like a pool of shared meaning, a place where you can have conversation. And anytime you start to resort to, silence, or we want to call violence, right? Like, getting either I'm going to take the high road and I'm just not going to say anything, or I'm going to,
Yeah.
kind of get critical, that we've stepped out of a place where we can have dialogue. Like you and I are talking about, whether I could say I'm, focused on weight loss. What do we both agree on, and where can we start to have dialogue and understand what's important to each other, and
Right.
really find we always have more in common than we do difference. I don't, um, I
Yeah.
don't I think that this is important as registered dietitians to not, I mean, we say, well, I'm on one side or I'm on the other, but how do we get curious about, the beliefs, and how can we learn from one another? Because I really think we all really come from a place of wanting what's best and wanting to help, but we can always learn.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think like if you've had an experience where you felt attacked by a weight inclusive provider or a Hazeline provider or an intuitive eating dietitian, like if you felt attacked, you felt attacked. Like that's a valid feeling, right? And it sucks. And I wish that that didn't happen. Um,
But
and I can see where like that makes you like dig in your heels a little bit. Like this was kind of a crappy encounter. Like why did I have that? Whereas I had a conversation with someone for the podcast this week where she talked about her first introduction to intuitive eating was during her PhD program. She was working in an eating disorder treatment facility, and she was giving clients like in bodies that were different than your typical eating disorder body. She was telling them how to lose weight. And she had a dietitian come in who was like her preceptor basically and was like, here's why that's not okay. And here's an alternative if you feel open to it. And she like basically suggested she read the intuitive eating book. And it was like the way that this dietitian I was talking to remembers that encounter is she kept using the word graciously. She said,
right.
she so graciously gave me feedback about why that's harmful to my clients, whether they're in an eating disorder treatment facility or not. But she so graciously explained that to me. She so graciously introduced me to this concept of intuitive eating and then kind of waited for me to be ready. And I was like, what a lovely
Yeah.
experience for
Right.
you.
Like,
You
I think
know?
just stopping and asking yourself, could a rational, reasonable person believe this? And that
Yeah.
it forces you to say that a rational, reasonable person could think this way. So rather than, approaching it from that angle of,
Yeah.
no matter where you are, I had I usually get attacked. I got attacked by like my fifth grade son's friend about sugar, right? Like, you're a dietitian. We don't eat sugar in our house. You should know better than that. Like, all up and down me in my kitchen, right? So,
Oh man.
rational, reasonable. I'm sure his mother is a very rational, reasonable person, but they have a different belief system than maybe I necessarily
Yeah.
do. And I think how you handle those conversations is always, they happen whether you're talking about weight or you're talking about sports with your kid or after school activities. This is just life, right? How you have
Yeah.
dialogue is over
And
that.
I do want to call out the fact that like, especially in conversations like this, I mean, in all situations, but especially here, I carry a lot of thin privilege.
Yep.
And it has been called out to lots of providers that being in a smaller body, being in a thin body and holding these beliefs people are more likely to listen to you and to believe you because you hold the thin ideal. Like you are in the body that they believe is healthy, and therefore you, by like, transition, have more authority on these issues. And I think that's absolutely hugely problematic. And I think that what we see is the people who do tend to get heated, or the people who do tend to like approach some of these conversations with a little more of maybe sass or like impatience. I have a lot of compassion for them, because a lot of times it's because they've experienced discrimination, they've experienced stigma, and they're freaking tired of it, and they're tired of it being perpetuated. So I don't have that fatigue because it's not my lived experience. So I try really hard as often as I can to bring more patience and compassion and to invite that curiosity and to be gracious. I'm not saying I'm perfect about it, but I just want to say I completely understand sometimes where that fatigue comes from, and it's because those lived experiences are really exhausting.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about, we touched a little bit on client work, but oftentimes we're working with clients who are really struggling to, say, accept their body as it is. And you started to talk about some of the talking points, and I was like, oh man, I wish I was writing these down. So that conversation where, is there just a point where you're saying, well, you just refer them to work with somebody else, if maybe that's not, what are some things that have worked for you to have these conversations so that deep down, maybe that isn't really their just talk me through that. I think you know what I'm asking.
Totally, I do. So if I'm having an intro call with someone, like an example I can give is I recently talked to someone who has to meet a certain weight for her military requirements, which is hugely problematic. Active military members have to meet a certain weight to stay in service, or they get kicked out. Huge issue with that, but I can't change it, right? So I said to her, and I empathize with her. I'm like, you are between a rock and a hard place, and I cannot promise you weight loss. Ethically, I can't bring you on and say, yeah, we'll change your weight and do that. Like, I just can't. So what I can do is provide support, and we can work on intuitive eating. We can work on non-diet things, and maybe your weight comes down. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it goes up. Maybe it stays the same. I don't know. I can't ever say for sure. So that's an example of a client where I had so much empathy for her, and I felt so bad for her situation, but I couldn't bring her on and say I just can't feel good about that. I can't promise you that. And also I can't promise you that. I can't promise that you'll lose weight, So that's an example of a client where I'm like, this just isn't a good fit, and I'm so sorry. Because unfortunately, I think she really did want that non-diet approach, and she recognizes the trouble, the hard place that she's in trying to manipulate her body. Another example would be, my doctor says I need to lose weight, so I looked up a dietitian and I found you.
Right.
That was probably not a fun conversation that he or she had with her doctor. So first I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I bet that wasn't great to hear. And, is that something that you're interested in, or is it what you're being told to do? And more often than not, it's some mix between the two, because again, we live in a culture that idealizes thin bodies. So well, sure. It'd be great if my body was thin. I would fit into this society way more easily, and I wouldn't face discrimination. But also I'm really tired of dieting. Those are the two things that I see, those are opposing forces, it feels like. And so I will say, listen, I'm an intuitive eating dietitian. I take a non-diet approach. We don't focus on weight. We focus on behaviors that are important to you and health promoting behaviors. We focus on finding a pattern of eating that feels great to you, that incorporates your food preferences, and that feels sustainable for your lifestyle. Again, I don't promise a weight outcome, and we don't focus on weight. So if that feels like a good fit to you and you think that's what you're looking for, then great, let's try and work together. And sometimes there are those people who still hold on to the idea that they want to lose weight, but they're interested enough in a non-diet respectful approach that is going to come from someone who isn't going to harbor on their weight, which is so opposite of what they've always experienced. That it's oh, I kind of that does kind of appeal to me. I'll at least try it, is it a great fit for everyone? Are they always ready for that message? No, but that's the only way that I can practice. So those are just some of the conversations that I might have with someone. And then sometimes it's no, I want intuitive eating and I found you. So let's go. Great, let's go. Sounds good.
Do you think it's the client being in a certain place? Because I feel if in your heart you believe that, if we believe that being weight inclusive and not using weight as a marker of health, but that they're just too focused on weight loss that's saying, well, you're gonna have to go see another provider who's going to, help you lose weight, feels
No,
tough, right? Like, how do you
yeah,
swallow that as a
yeah.
clinician, right?
So I really try not to do that as hard as I can. If the client feels like it's important to them that they work with someone else, and like, again, who am I to say like, no, you shouldn't? They have to feel like it's a good fit for them. But if most of the time, I feel like, you develop that rapport with your clients and they are at least interested in hearing you out, even if it's not really what they want to hear. And so we can dig into that. Like, okay, where do you think the desire to lose weight comes from? Like, what's at the root of that? How many layers can we remove before we get to the root of it?
Do you think, Lorena has a question here about what if losing weight is important for the client and how he or she can, be supported? Is it tricking them to be, going along with their goal for weight loss, but you really know that what you're working on is behaviors, so you're not really, I guess, do you see what I'm
Yeah.
saying here, right? Because you're
So
going to send them away, right?
I will say that like each practitioner is going to take their own approach. So some people are really research focused and love presenting research and studies to clients. And sometimes that works. It depends on the client. I think you kind of have to know your client. Some people would say like, let's just continue for as long as we can to kind of put weight loss goals aside, but we can still talk about how you're feeling in your body, what experiences you're having. We could talk about, how do these behaviors feel to you? What are some other non-weight focused things that we can hone in on, at least in a session? Like, again, just for that session, can we maybe just put weight loss aside? I'm not forgetting about it. I'm not negating your desire for it. I'm not invalidating it. I just want to put it over here. And what are some other things we can focus on? So some things that come to mind might be like, are you sleeping better with this approach that we're taking, where we really focus on eating enough and eating frequently and eating foods that you like? Are you sleeping better? Do you have less anxiety in social situations? Are you feeling more present in your meals with your family, versus like, oh, well, I eat this and my family eats that because I can't eat what my family eats. Like it's too much, or, whatever. So we focus on those non-weight based wins, or like non-weight based successes. And then we still say like, I didn't forget about this. I know this weight loss thing is over here, and we can come back to it whenever you want. And I'm happy to dig into it with you. But again, if you can kind of get to the root of that, like what's at the root of it? And if it really is improved health, we have lots of other evidence-based ways to improve health. So like we can offer that. If it's, I want to change my body because I don't feel good in my body, that's where we do body image work, which I can recommend some trainings for that, but you can also refer in a therapist.
Yes.
If it's, my doctor told me to lose weight, well, like,
what do you believe?
I'm sorry that your doctor is operating within a weight-centric model, and we can't change that. I mean, sometimes you can talk to physicians if you feel up for that task. So there are a lot of different ways that you could approach that. And I won't say one way is better than the other. Like each practitioner kind of has their preferences, and each client is going to respond differently to different approaches.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting for me, and I feel like I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but I want to be cognizant of time and making sure that, if I probably have time for maybe one more question around kind of tools and resources.
Yeah.
There's a lot out there, but what's the really best places to go and like to get a good foundation, and then, not necessarily just sound bites, but really learn. I hope I'm asking that correctly. Like really things that are going to help in practice, not just maybe get a lot of likes on social media.
Totally. I love that question. So because I already mentioned it, it's a little out of order, but body image is a huge topic that comes up. And as Marcy Evans will say, like if you work with clients, you work with bodies. So
Yes,
like whether or not you think that that's within your scope, it is within your scope. And we are going to be better clinicians if we feel more equipped to handle those conversations. So check out Marcy Evans. It's marcyrd.com. She has a great body image training. I highly recommend looking into that, especially if you do one-on-one counseling in any capacity. So I would start with that in terms of the body image stuff. Otherwise, some really good places to start, if you feel open to it, would be reading the Intuitive Eating book. There's a 4th edition coming out in 2020, so maybe hold off for that. So I would definitely start with that, and the book Health at Every Size. And they're both kind of dense, but like for a practitioner, I think they can both be relatively quick reads. I encourage you to join our WIND Facebook group. I am working very hard to make that a safe space where you can stay curious and ask questions. And there are lots of different Facebook groups, but they all kind of operate on different levels of assumed knowledge. So I think WIND is a good place to start if you're open to joining us. And then another group that I would recommend for entrepreneurs is Inspired to Seek, and that's INSPIRD, so no E in the Inspired to Seek. And that is a entrepreneur-based group for weight-inclusive providers, but I find it to be a very safe space as well for asking questions. And they just introduced a really great course on marketing a weight-inclusive business. So to your point, that's hard to do. And then I would start also listening to different podcasts. So I'll be shameless and plug my own. We just did a series on health at every size to try to help people better understand the movement and the principles, because there are 5 principles of health at every size. So my podcast is RD Real Talk. The other ones that I find great for an introduction to some of these concepts would be Nutrition Matters by Paige Smathers, Food Heaven by Wendy Lopez and Jess Jones, and then Love Food by Julie Duffy Dillon. And then Food Psych by Kirsty Harrison is incredible, but I do think that's a little more geared towards people who are already kind of in this world and like interested in weight inclusive stuff. So I wouldn't say that's a great intro necessarily, but that's kind of how I started learning about it. So it could be a great intro. It just depends on kind of where you are in terms of like your, I don't know, curiosity or interest or whatever. So yeah.
Nice. Wow. And then you also have some resources both on RD2RD, and then what do you want to share about what you have available?
Yeah. So on weightinclusivenutrition.com, you can join our newsletter and stay up to date on all of the resources that we're releasing over the next couple of months. So we have events coming up next year. We're doing some community meetups in different cities. We have that free guide to weight inclusive practices, which is very much like an intro level guide, and includes a little self-assessment and some research. And then we have some webinars, and we're working on some different courses for next year. So yeah, stay tuned with that.
Yes, definitely do. So Heather, this was really helpful. I really wanted to dive into some depth around this topic and maybe just kind of bring up some things that maybe don't get talked about, or it's difficult to on like Twitter perhaps, or Instagram on a visual post, because I really respect you, and I love that, you know, what you're doing around these conversations and really creating a safe place for people to talk, because I really do think that anytime we aren't having good dialogue as a profession, we're losing, right? We're always better together.
Good.
No, it doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good. So for me personally, it hurts when I think there's nothing wrong with arguing, but I think there's a difference between respectful like conversation and dialogue and just really slinging of opinions without any curiosity. And I think that you brought that up a number of times, of staying curious. What can I learn and how can I continue to grow as a practitioner, no matter where I am, and you know, and my beliefs and things, and how can I learn and grow ultimately, not how can I continue to confirm what I already believe and think is true. And so I think encouraging that curiosity. So go out, check out the resources that Heather provided, and I will try to type those up as like a summary, because there were a lot of
I have a list.
Yeah, okay.
I can send a list over to you. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Heather, thank you. For those of you here, if you have any questions, you can drop them in and I'll try to link back to them. We'll be back in 2 weeks with actually a guest from Simple Practice. Maggie, she's coming on to talk about insurance reimbursement. Oh yes, she is going to talk about getting reimbursed for nutrition care. She actually worked as an insurance billing for a while, so she's definitely knows a lot about that topic. So we're going to dive into that, because I know it's always fun as a dietitian to talk about insurance and billing and reimbursement. So hope you join us in a couple of weeks for that. All right, so thanks again, Heather, for being on as a guest today, and I'll catch up with you again soon.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Yep, bye-bye. I'm going to try to end this stream. Oh no. Everyone's like, I don't know how to end. Oh, here we go. All right, toodaloo.
Got it.